The silence was the first thing that hit Kristen Barker. Not the peaceful, curated quiet of his Upper East Side mansion, but a dead, hollow void that consumed the space. The air, usually circulating with the faint scent of lilies and lemon oil, was stale. He dropped his leather weekender, the thud echoing off the marble floors. "Maria," he called out, his voice sounding foreign in his own home. He walked through the grand foyer, past the silent living room, and up the sweeping staircase. In their bedroom, a single object sat on her nightstand, catching the sliver of moonlight from the window, a positive pregnancy test. And beside it, a note. 2 sentences in her perfect script that shattered his world. The morning Kristen left, the air in the 6,000-square-foot penthouse was already thin with unspoken words. Maria Truitt stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the yellow cabs crawl along Fifth Avenue like beetles. She was 3 months pregnant, a secret she held coiled in her stomach like a nervous bird. The morning sickness had been relentless, a daily reminder of the life growing inside her, and the chasm growing between her and her husband. She hadn't told him yet. How could she? Every attempt to connect, to find the man she'd married 5 years ago, was met with a wall of polite indifference. Kristen Barker, a man who had built a private equity empire by seeing 10 steps ahead, was blind to the person standing 5 feet away from him. He moved through the master suite with practiced efficiency, his reflection, sharp suit, confident jaw, flashing in the mirrored closet doors. His suitcase, a sleek Rimowa, was already packed by the door. "Everything set for the St. Bart's trip?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Her hand rested instinctively on her belly, a gesture she quickly hid. "It's not a trip, Maria. It's a strategic retreat," he corrected, without looking at her. He was fastening a Patek Philippe to his wrist, the metallic click punctuating the silence. "The Sterling Reed acquisition is in its final stages. Scott Stotler and I need to iron out the finer points without the noise of the city." Scott Stotler. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. The new wunderkind partner Kristen had brought on 6 months ago. Scott was everything Kristen admired, ruthless, innovative, and unburdened by sentiment. Lately, the name was on Kristen's lips more often than hers. Late nights at the office became strategy sessions with Scott. Weekend calls were running numbers with Scott. Maria had seen them together at a gala once. Scott, with his sharp, tailored suits and an easy charm that felt predatory, had barely acknowledged her existence. "I see," she said softly. She had planned to tell him today. She had imagined it 100 times, a quiet dinner, a small wrapped gift with tiny baby shoes inside, a flicker of the old warmth returning to his eyes. But looking at him now, a stranger in a hurry, the words died in her throat. "Don't wait up for me," he said, finally turning to her. He scanned her attire, a simple cashmere sweater and jeans, with a flicker of something unreadable. Was it disappointment? "I'll be back Friday. We have the museum benefit on Saturday, so make sure you have that blue dress from the couturier ready." He didn't ask how she was. He didn't notice the faint shadows under her eyes or the way she'd lost weight in her face. He was giving instructions, managing his asset. A wave of nausea and a surge of unexpected anger rose in her. "What if I don't want to go to the benefit, Kristen?" He paused, genuinely surprised by the resistance. "Don't be difficult, Maria. It's important for appearances. You know that." He walked over and gave her a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. His cologne, a scent she once loved, now smelled sterile, like a hospital. "I'll call you from the island. Be good." The condescension in those 2 words, "be good," was a slap. It was what you said to a child or a pet. As the front door clicked shut, Sealing her inside the silent, opulent cage, Maria felt the full weight of her isolation. This magnificent apartment, with its panoramic views of Central Park, had become her prison. Her life, once vibrant with her own ambitions in art curation, had been slowly eroded, replaced by the all-consuming role of being Mrs. Kristen Barker. He hadn't forced her to quit her job at the gallery. He had simply made it impossible to continue, with a social calendar so demanding and a life so insular that her own world had simply faded away. She walked slowly into their master bathroom, a cavern of Italian marble and polished chrome. Her reflection looked pale, a ghost haunting a palace. She had married Kristen for his drive, his brilliance, his promises of a partnership. But somewhere along the way, partnership had become ownership. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a beautiful, silent testament to his success. And now, there was a baby. Their baby. A life that deserved more than a father who saw his family as an accessory, and a mother who was slowly disappearing. The nausea returned, but this time it wasn't just the pregnancy. It was the sickening realization that the man she loved was gone, and the man who remained would never be the father her child deserved. Not like this. Standing there, with the city's indifferent hum below, a new feeling began to take root in the pit of her stomach, pushing past the fear and the sickness. It was a cold, hard seed of resolve. She had been good for too long. The private jet descended toward Gustav III Airport, a ribbon of tarmac nestled between a steep hill and the turquoise sea. From his window seat, Kristen watched the island of St. Bart's materialize from the azure expanse of the Caribbean. It was a playground for the world's elite, a place where billion-dollar deals were sealed over rosé on the decks of superyachts. It was his natural habitat. Almost there, Scott Stotler said, leaning across the aisle. He was dressed in a crisp linen shirt, his smile as bright and artificial as the resort brochures. Ready to close the deal of the decade? Ready to be done with it, Kristen replied, his gaze still fixed on the window. An unsettling feeling had been gnawing at him since he left New York. He'd dismissed it as pre-deal jitters, but it felt different. It felt personal. He thought of Maria's face when he left, the strange defiance in her eyes. What if I don't want to go? She'd never questioned him like that before. The villa was spectacular, a modern architectural marvel carved into the hillside of Lurin, with an infinity pool that bled into the horizon. A personal butler uncorked a bottle of vintage champagne as they arrived. Scott raised his glass. To Sterling Reed, he toasted. And to us, the new kings of the street. Kristen clinked his glass against Scott's, but the celebratory fizz felt flat. For the next 2 days, they worked. They spread financial projections across a glass table overlooking the ocean, their laptops humming in the tropical heat. Scott was brilliant, his mind a razor-sharp instrument that sliced through complex problems with an almost surgical precision. He was charming and witty, and Kristen could see why he was so effective in a boardroom. But as the hours wore on, Kristen started to notice the cracks in Scott's polished facade. There was a dismissiveness in the way Scott spoke about the people they were acquiring, a casual cruelty disguised as business acumen. He was a shark who loved the taste of blood. During a break, Kristen's phone buzzed. It was Maria. He ignored it. "Wife checking in?" Scott asked, not looking up from his screen. "Something like that," Kristen muttered. "Give them an inch. They take a mile," Scott said with a knowing smirk. "Best to keep them on a short leash. They appreciate the structure." The comment landed with a thud, echoing the very sentiment Kristen had felt when he'd told Maria to be good. Hearing it from someone else, so crudely put, made him deeply uncomfortable. He thought of Maria in their quiet apartment, managing the vast emptiness of their life while he was here, in paradise, with a man who viewed relationships as transactions. That evening, after a dinner of grilled lobster at a chic beachside restaurant, the pretense of business finally dissolved. They returned to the villa, the night air thick with the scent of jasmine and salt. Scott poured 2 glasses of aged rum. "You know, Kristen," Scott began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "We're more alike than you think. We see the world for what it is. A game. The only thing that matters is winning." He moved closer, his presence suddenly intimate, invasive. "That acquisition, it's just the beginning. With your capital and my vision, there's no ceiling." Scott's hand rested on Kristen's shoulder. The gesture lingered a fraction of a second too long. In that moment, Kristen understood the full scope of their partnership. It wasn't just about business. It was about power, about allegiance, about a shared worldview that prized ambition above all else. This trip wasn't just a strategic retreat. It was a seduction, an invitation to fully embrace the ruthless, detached persona he had so carefully constructed. His phone buzzed again. Maria. This time he felt a sharp, inexplicable pang of something. Guilt. No, that wasn't it. It was a longing for a different kind of quiet. Not the sterile silence of their penthouse, but the comfortable silence they used to share years ago, when they would read in bed together, their feet tangled under the sheets. When had that stopped? He pulled away from Scott's touch. "I should call her back." Scott's smile tightened. "Don't tell me the great Kristen Barker is domesticated. I thought you were past all that." "It's complicated," Kristen said, the words tasting like a lie. It wasn't complicated at all. It was brutally simple. He had made a choice, long ago, to prioritize the game. Maria was simply a casualty of his ambition. He had told himself it was what success required. But as he stood on the balcony, with the stars glittering over a dark, indifferent ocean, and a man he didn't respect standing behind him, he felt a profound emptiness. He had won, and won, and won. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far more valuable along the way. He silenced his phone, pushing the feeling down. There would be time for complications later. Right now, there was a deal to close. Kristen Barker stepped out of the black Escalade and into the jarring silence of his own life. The St. Bart's trip had been a success. The Sterling Reed deal was signed, a landmark acquisition that would be front-page news in the Wall Street Journal. Scott was ecstatic, already planning the next corporate conquest. But the triumph felt hollow, the victory tasting of seawater and regret. The entire flight back, a single thought had looped in his mind. He needed to talk to Maria. Really talk, for the first time in years. He walked into the mansion, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a funereal boom. "Maria!" he called out. The silence that answered was absolute. It seeped from the cold marble floors and dripped from the crystal chandeliers. An unnerving stillness had claimed the space. The perfectly arranged lilies in the foyer were wilting, their petals browning at the edges. The staff had the day off. It should have been just her. He took the stairs 2 at a time, a knot of dread tightening in his chest. "Maria," he called again, his voice strained. The master bedroom was empty. The bed was perfectly made, but it was the bed their housekeeper made, crisp and impersonal. Maria's bed was always a nest of pillows and rumpled sheets. On his side of the bed, on his nightstand, sat his watch window, his valet tray, his world exactly as he'd left it. On her side, there was only the pregnancy test and the note. He picked up the test first, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 2 pink lines. Pregnant. The word detonated in the quiet of his mind. Maria was pregnant. A flash of memory, her hand on her stomach that morning, her strange question about the benefit, the shadows under her eyes. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. She had been trying to tell him, and he had been too busy, too important, too gone. His hand shaking, he reached for the note. It was written on her personal stationery, the heavy, cream-colored paper embossed with her initials. M.T. Maria Truitt. Not M.B. The detail was a tiny, sharp cut. The note said, "You've already chosen your future. I'm going to choose ours. Ours." The word was an enigma. Him and her and the baby, or just her and the baby? He read it again and again, the elegant script mocking him. It wasn't an angry, tear-stained letter. It was calm, resolute, and utterly final. It was the note of a woman who had made a decision, not a plea from a woman who was hurting. A cold panic, unlike any boardroom pressure he'd ever felt, seized him. He pulled out his phone, his thumb fumbling as he dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail, her cheerful, recorded voice, a ghost from a life that had existed only hours ago. "Maria, pick up the phone," he said into the silence. "This isn't funny. Whatever you're thinking, we can talk about it. I'm home. Just call me." He hung up and dialed her mother in Connecticut. "Kristen, how was St. Bart's?" Eleanor Truitt's voice was warm, oblivious. "Eleanor, is Maria with you?" he asked, his voice tight. "Maria?" "No, of course not. She's in the city. Is everything all right? You sound strange." "She's not here. There's a note." A pause. When Eleanor spoke again, the warmth was gone, replaced by an icy civility. "And why exactly would she have left a note, Kristen?" The unspoken accusation hung in the air. He made a clumsy excuse and hung up. He called her sister, her best friend from college, the gallery she used to work at. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. It was as if she had stepped out of their meticulously designed life and simply evaporated. He stalked through the apartment, opening closets, his heart pounding. Half her clothes were gone, her favorite sweaters, her comfortable jeans, the simple gold locket her grandmother had given her. But the designer gowns, the expensive jewelry he'd bought her, the symbols of her life as Mrs. Barker, they were all still there, hanging like costumes for a play that had closed. He sank onto the edge of their bed, the note clutched in his hand. The sheer intentionality of it was staggering. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was a calculated departure. She had planned this. While he was in paradise closing a deal, she was methodically erasing herself from his life. The arrogance that had defined him for so long began to crumble, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. He had built an empire on the principle of control. Every variable managed, every outcome predicted. But he had never factored in the one person who shared his home, his bed, his life. He had treated her as a constant, a given, a beautiful fixture in the architecture of his success. He had never once considered that she had a choice. And now, in the deafening silence of the gilded cage he had built, Kristen Barker was faced with a terrifying new reality. He was completely, utterly alone. 1 week after Kristen returned to an empty home, the perfect facade of his life had developed visible cracks. The initial panic had morphed into a low, simmering dread that tainted every waking moment. Maria was still gone. Her phone remained off. Her bank accounts were untouched, save for a single, modest ATM withdrawal in cash the day she left. She had vanished as completely as a wisp of smoke. Kristen had done what powerful men do when faced with a problem they can't solve. He threw money at it. He hired Jason Pereira, a private investigator whose name had been passed to him with hushed reverence. Pereira was not the type of man Kristen was used to dealing with. He was quiet, unassuming, with watchful eyes that seemed to see right through Christen's tailored suits and carefully constructed composure. They sat in Christen's home office, a room panelled in dark mahogany that suddenly felt like a tomb. Pereira held a small notebook, his expression unreadable. "Let's go over it one more time, Mr. Barker," Pereira said, his voice calm but firm. "The morning you left, tell me everything she said. Everything you said. The exact words, if you can." Christen recounted the conversation, the words feeling clumsy and cruel as he spoke them aloud. "Don't be difficult. Be good. I told her to have the blue dress ready for a party." He felt a flush of shame. Hearing himself, he sounded like a monster, a petty, controlling tyrant. Pereira jotted down a note. "And you had no idea she was pregnant?" "None." The word was a lead weight. How could he have been so blind? All the signs had been there, hiding in plain sight. "The trip to St. Bart's," Pereira continued, his gaze unwavering. "You were there with your business partner, Scott Stotler. Was it strictly business?" The question was a scalpel, expertly inserted. "Yes," Christen said, too quickly. Pereira just looked at him, letting the silence stretch. He didn't accuse. He didn't push. He simply waited. It was a more effective interrogation technique than any shouting match. "Our partnership is multifaceted," Christen finally admitted, the corporate jargon a pathetic shield. "I see," Pereira said, though his eyes suggested he saw much more. "The thing is, Mr. Barker, people don't just vanish. They run. From something or to something. To understand where your wife went, I need to understand what she was running from. I need the whole picture, not the version you give to the press. The whole picture. The picture was ugly. It was a marriage hollowed out by ambition, a wife treated like a commodity, a husband who sought validation in the arms of a man who was a mirror image of his own worst qualities. Days bled into one another. Christen stopped going into the office. He sat in the silent mansion, the note and the pregnancy test on his desk, like a shrine to his failure. He found himself wandering into Maria's walk-in closet, touching the silk of the gowns she'd left behind. He remembered the day she'd bought one of them, a deep emerald dress. Her eyes had lit up when she tried it on. "It makes me feel like myself," she'd said. He'd barely looked up from his phone. "It's fine. Buy it." The PI's reports were thin. Maria was smart. She hadn't used credit cards. She wasn't staying with any known friends or family. She had withdrawn a few $1,000s, enough to live on for a while, but not enough to suggest a life of luxury. She had planned her escape with the precision of a spy. The cracks in his life began to spread. His business partners started calling, their voices edged with concern. The Sterling Reed integration was stalling without his leadership. Scott called incessantly, his voice a mixture of frustration and something else. Fear? "Christen, you need to get a grip," Scott's voice hissed over the phone. "Whatever domestic drama you're having, shelve it. We have a board to answer to. If word gets out that your wife left you and you're falling apart, it'll spook the investors. It makes you look unstable." "My pregnant wife is missing," Christen shot back, his voice raw. "Then find her quietly," Scott snapped. "Don't let this derail everything we've worked for." Everything we've worked for. The words hung in the air. For Scott, Maria was just a variable, a potential liability that needed to be managed. It was a chilling echo of Christen's own past behavior. He was looking at his reflection, and he was disgusted. That night, unable to sleep, Christen found an old photo album tucked away in a bookshelf. It was from the early years of their marriage. There they were, smiling in a small, cramped apartment in the West Village, before the money, before the empire. There was Maria, her face bright with laughter, holding up a misshapen pot she'd made in a pottery class. There was Christen, looking at her with an adoration that was so open, so genuine, it made his current self ache. He had been that man. A man who could love someone more than he loved a deal. Where had he gone? He hadn't just lost Maria. He had lost himself. Staring at the photograph, Kristen Barker finally did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He wept. It was a gut-wrenching, silent sob. A torrent of grief for the man he had failed to be, the wife he had driven away, and the child he might never know. The unraveling was complete. Now he had to figure out how to build something new from the wreckage. 200 miles north of the city, in a small town nestled in the Hudson Valley, Maria Truitt was breathing for the first time in years. She had run, not to a 5-star hotel or a hidden resort, but to the one place she was certain Kristen's world would never touch, the cluttered, cozy home of her great-aunt Genevieve. Jen was a retired librarian in her late 70s, a woman who lived in a world of dusty first editions, overgrown gardens, and strong cups of herbal tea. She had taken one look at a pale, trembling Maria on her doorstep and simply said, "The guest room is ready, dear. You look like you could use a rest." There were no questions, no judgments, just a quiet, sturdy acceptance that was more healing than any words could be. The first week, Maria did little more than sleep. She slept off years of accumulated exhaustion, of walking on eggshells, of shrinking herself to fit into the small, ornamental box Kristen had built for her. The relentless morning sickness was her constant companion, a physical manifestation of the life she was purging. Slowly, the fog began to lift. She started spending her mornings in Jen's wild garden, her hands in the soil, feeling the solid, reassuring earth beneath her fingernails. She helped Jen prune the roses and weed the vegetable patch. The simple, honest work grounded her. Here, her worth wasn't measured by the designer she wore or the benefit she attended. It was measured by the ripeness of a tomato, the beauty of a blooming peony. She began to explore the small town of Cold Spring. It was the antithesis of her Manhattan life. The streets were lined with independent bookshops, antique stores, and cafes where people actually looked up from their phones and smiled at one another. It was here, in a bookstore called The Narrative, that she met Dr. Jason Pereira. He wasn't a doctor in the store, of course. He was just a man in a worn flannel shirt, searching for a collection of Mary Oliver poems. He and Maria reached for the same book at the same time, a cliché so charmingly out of place in her dramatic life that it made her laugh. A real, genuine laugh. "Sorry about that," he said, his smile warm and easy. "You can have it. Good choice." "You're a fan?" she asked. "Her work is an antidote to modern life," he said. "Reminds you what's real." They talked for 20 minutes, leaning against the bookshelves, about poetry, about the city versus the country, about the simple pleasure of a quiet afternoon. He told her he was a family doctor in town. He didn't ask about her, or why a woman with a sadness in her eyes was hiding out in Cold Spring. He just listened. He saw her, not the wife of a millionaire, not a story to be dissected. Just Maria. Their encounters became a quiet routine. A nod on the street, a brief chat at the farmer's market. Jason would ask her how she was feeling, and she found herself answering honestly. "Tired today," she'd admit. "The baby is making its presence known." He never pried about the father. He simply offered gentle advice. "Ginger tea helps with the nausea, and make sure you're getting enough iron." He'd recommend a local prenatal yoga class or a walking trail with a gentle incline. His kindness was simple, expecting nothing in return. It was a language Kristen had long forgotten how to speak. One afternoon, sitting on a bench overlooking the Hudson River, Maria felt the baby kick for the first time. A tiny, definitive flutter. It was a secret conversation, a promise between her and her child. In that moment, her decision to leave was reaffirmed with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. She wasn't just running from Kristen. She was running to this. To a life where her child could grow up surrounded by real things. Soil, books, quiet kindness. She was under no illusions. Life would be hard. She had limited funds and no clear plan. But for the first time, her future felt like her own. It was a blank page, and she was the one holding the pen. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of hope. Kristen had taken her name, her career, her confidence. But he couldn't take this. This life, this future, was hers to write, and she was finally ready to begin. She wasn't Maria Barker, the vanished wife. She was Maria Truitt, a mother-to-be, planting roots in the quiet, steady earth. Back in New York, Kristen Barker's world was contracting. The walls of his empire, once impenetrable, were beginning to show stress fractures. The private investigator, the other Jason Pereira, a man whose quiet competence felt like a constant judgment, had finally found a promising lead. A credit card charge, not from Maria, but one he recognized. Maria had an old, forgotten supplementary card on her great-aunt's account, a card she'd set up years ago for emergencies. It had been used once, a month prior, to purchase a prenatal yoga book from an online store with a shipping address in Cold Spring, New York. It was a thread, thin but tangible. Kristen felt a surge of adrenaline, the familiar thrill of the hunt. He would go there, find her, and fix this. He would bring her home. But as he made plans, another crisis was reaching its boiling point. The Sterling Reed integration was failing spectacularly. Key executives from the acquired company were resigning, citing a hostile culture. The media was sniffing around, and the narrative they were weaving was one of chaos and instability at Barker Capital. And at the center of that narrative was Scott Stotler. Scott, desperate to control the damage, called an emergency board meeting. He strode into the conference room on the 50th floor, all sharp angles and predatory confidence, ready to pin the blame squarely on Kristen's personal distractions. "Kristen has been absent," Scott announced to the stern-faced board members. "His focus has been compromised by a domestic issue, and as a result, the transition has suffered. I propose that I take full operational control until he has resolved his private matters." It was a power play, slick and ruthless. The board murmured, their faces a mixture of concern and calculation. Kristen looked at Scott, at the man who was a perfect reflection of the monster he himself had become, a man who would sacrifice anyone and anything for the next win. And in that moment, something inside Kristen snapped. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about the deal, or the money, or the power. It was about the photograph in his desk drawer of a laughing woman covered in clay. Kristen stood up. The room fell silent. He wasn't the man who had left for St. Bart's. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion that was more compelling than any bravado. "He's right," Kristen said, his voice quiet but carrying across the vast room. "I have been absent. My focus has been compromised." He looked at each board member, making eye contact. "For years I have told myself, and all of you, that business comes first, that success requires a singular, relentless focus. I built this company on that principle, and I built my life on it too." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And I was wrong. My methods created a culture, both in this office and in my home, that valued results over people. It has cost this company valuable talent, and it has cost me my family." Scott's face was a mask of disbelief. This was not part of the script. "My wife, Maria, is pregnant," Kristen continued, the words raw and difficult. "And she has left me. She left because the man I had become was not someone she could build a future with." She was right. A collective gasp went through the room. This wasn't a business meeting anymore. It was a confession. "Scott's proposal is sound," Kristen said, his gaze finally landing on his former partner. "He embodies the principles on which Barker Capital was founded. But those principles are flawed. They are empty." He looked back at the board. "Therefore, I am taking an indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately. I'm stepping down as CEO. You need someone whose head is in the game, and my head and my heart need to be somewhere else entirely." He turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a stunned silence and the ruins of his professional life. He didn't feel regret. He didn't feel fear. For the first time in a decade, he felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He had torched his own empire, confessed his sins not to a priest, but to the gods of capitalism he had once worshipped. He walked out of the building, not waiting for his driver, and started walking downtown. He pulled out his phone and called the investigator. "Pereira," he said, "I'm done here. I'm going to Cold Spring, but not as a CEO coming to collect his wife. I'm going as a man who has a lot of listening to do." He was under no illusions. This wasn't an act that would win her back. It was simply the first step on a long, uncertain road toward becoming a man she wouldn't have to run from. The drive to Cold Spring was a 2-hour pilgrimage through his own failure. Every mile Kristen put between himself and the city, he felt the weight of his old life sloughing off. He wasn't Kristen Barker, the titan of industry. He was just Kristen, a man driving a borrowed sedan because his own car and driver felt like relics from another existence. He carried no grand plan of reconciliation, only a fragile hope for a conversation. He found Aunt Genevieve's house easily. It was a charming, slightly ramshackle cottage, surrounded by a riot of late summer flowers. It looked like a place where real life happened. He took a deep breath and walked up the stone path. Before he could knock, the door opened. It was Maria. She was more beautiful than he remembered. Her face had a softness to it, a serenity that had been absent for years. Her pregnancy was obvious now, a gentle, swelling curve beneath her simple cotton dress. She wasn't surprised to see him. There was no shock, no anger, just a weary resignation. "I knew you'd find me eventually," she said, her voice calm. She didn't invite him in. She just stood in the doorway, a protective barrier. "Maria, he started, but the words he'd rehearsed died on his lips. They all sounded hollow. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I've changed. They were just words." "Why are you here, Kristen?" she asked, her eyes searching his, looking for the man she knew, the man who always wanted something. "To talk," he said simply, "to listen, to understand." From inside the house, a man's voice called out, "Maria, is everything okay?" Dr. Jason Pereira appeared behind her. He was holding 2 cups of tea, his expression one of quiet concern. He looked at Kristen, then at Maria, and a wave of primal, irrational jealousy washed over Kristen. It was so immediate and ugly it took his breath away. This man, in his simple, unassuming way, had what Kristen had thrown away: Maria's trust. "It's fine, Jason," Maria said, never taking her eyes off Kristen. "Could you give us a minute?" Jason nodded, gave Kristen one last, assessing look, and retreated into the house. The gesture was one of respect for Maria's autonomy, and it was a deeper condemnation of Kristen than any shouting match could ever be. "He's a friend," Maria stated, preempting the question in Kristen's eyes. "He's been kind." kind. The word was a knife. "I'm glad," Kristen said, and to his surprise, he meant it. "I'm glad you haven't been alone." They stood in silence for a long moment. The sounds of the small town, a distant train whistle, the chirping of crickets, filled the space between them. "I stepped down from the company," he said finally. Maria raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes. "Why?" "Because it was costing me everything that mattered. Because the man it turned me into was a man you had to run from. And you were right to run." This was the truth, unvarnished and painful. She seemed to consider this, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "So what now? You show up here, having shed your old life, and expect what? That I'll just forget? That we can go back?" "No," he said quickly. "God, no. I don't want to go back. That life was a prison for both of us. I don't expect you to forget or forgive. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you?" she repeated, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. He took a step closer, his heart aching with the chasm between them. "I'm here because I'm going to be a father. And that child, our child, deserves better than the man I was. I'm not asking for a second chance with you, Maria. I know I don't deserve one. I'm asking for a chance to be a father, to be present, to be kind." He laid his soul bare in that one word. It was all he had to offer. Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had shed all her tears for that man long ago. This man in front of her was someone new, someone broken and trying to piece himself back together. "That's not up to me alone," she said, her hand going to her belly. "It's up to him. Or her. And it's something you'll have to earn. Every single day." She finally stepped back, opening the door a little wider. "Do you want to come in for some tea? We have a lot to figure out." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reunion. But it was an opening, a fragile, tentative beginning. As Kristen Barker stepped across the threshold of the small, flower-covered cottage, he knew he was leaving the ruins of his old life behind and taking the first, terrifying step into an unknown future he would have to build. Not with money or power, but with patience, humility, and a hope for grace. The months that followed were an exercise in radical patience. Kristen did not move to Cold Spring. He did not pressure Maria or crowd her space. He respected the boundary she had drawn, a line demarcating her new life from the wreckage of their old one. He sold the cavernous Upper East Side mansion, a public act that was also a deeply personal one. He let go of the symbol of their shared failure. He moved into a modest apartment in the West Village, just a few blocks from where they had first lived, a place where the scale of life felt human again. His new life was structured not around market openings and board meetings, but around Maria and the baby. He drove upstate twice a week. At first, it was for the doctor's appointments with Jason Pereira, where he would sit quietly in the corner, listening to the steady, miraculous thump of his child's heartbeat. He watched with a painful mix of awe and regret as Jason treated Maria with a gentle, professional respect that felt more intimate than any affair. He learned to swallow his jealousy, recognizing it as the ghost of his own possessiveness. Jason was Maria's doctor and her friend. That was all. Kristen had no claim here. His visits slowly evolved. He would come up and help Aunt Genevieve in the garden, his hands, once accustomed only to the smooth glass of a smartphone screen, becoming calloused from pulling weeds and turning soil. He learned the names of plants and the rhythms of the seasons. He and Maria would sit on the porch, talking. They didn't talk about their past. The wounds were too raw. Instead, they talked about the future, a future centered entirely around the child. They discussed names, birthing plans, parenting philosophies. Their conversations were practical, sometimes awkward, but always civil. They were two people learning to be partners in a new, more sacred venture. Kristen started therapy, a real, grueling examination of the man he had been. He confronted the bottomless insecurity that had fueled his ambition, the fear of not being enough that had driven him to acquire more and more money, more power, more validation, until he had suffocated the one person who had loved him for who he was, not what he owned. His atonement was not a grand gesture. It was 1,000 small, quiet acts. It was driving 2 hours in the snow to bring Maria the specific brand of ginger ale that settled her stomach. It was learning how to assemble a crib, his knuckles raw and his instructions hopelessly confusing, until he finally figured it out. It was sitting by her side through a 3-hour birthing class, a silent, supportive presence. The day their daughter was born, the world shifted on its axis. He stood in the delivery room, holding Maria's hand, a permission she had granted him only at the last moment, and watched as Lily Truitt Barker came into the world. He saw the strength, the primal power in Maria's face, and he was humbled to his core. When the nurse placed the tiny red-faced infant in his arms, the last remnants of the old Kristen Barker dissolved. This was real. This was love, pure and unconditional. He looked over at Maria, exhausted but glowing, her eyes fixed on their daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," Maria said, her gaze meeting his. "She is." In her eyes, he didn't see forgiveness. Not yet. But he saw something new, a shared purpose, a fragile respect, the beginning of a new kind of family, one they would have to build from scratch, piece by painful, honest piece. They were not a couple, not lovers. They were two parents, bound by a shared miracle. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, Kristen felt he was finally walking in the right direction, guided not by the glow of a stock ticker, but by the tiny, perfect hand wrapped around his finger. Kristen Barker's journey from a self-absorbed millionaire to a humbled father shows that redemption isn't a destination. It's a daily choice. He learned the hardest lesson of all. You can't own love. You can only earn the right to be near it. Maria Truitt, in finding the strength to vanish, ultimately found herself and created a new definition of family, one built on respect, not obligation. Their story isn't over. It's just beginning. Will Kristen's quiet atonement ever be enough to truly heal the wounds of the past? Can a love that was so completely broken ever be made whole again? What do you think should happen next for Maria, Kristen, and baby Lily? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of betrayal, strength, and the difficult path to redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional real-life dramas.
The sound of expensive heels clicking against marble floors echoed through the grand foyer of the Blackwood estate. Victoria Blackwood adjusted her pearl necklace one final time before pushing open the heavy oak doors to her husband's study. The scent of aged whiskey and cigar smoke greeted her, along with the low rumble of masculine voices discussing business deals that would reshape entire industries. "Richard, we need to talk about the Henderson acquisition," Victoria announced, her voice cutting through the conversation with practiced authority. Richard Blackwood, her millionaire ex-husband-to-be, though she didn't know it yet, barely glanced up from his conversation with 3 potential investors. His dismissive wave was as casual as swatting away an annoying fly. "Not now, Victoria. The men are talking business." The words hit her like a physical blow. 23 years of marriage had taught Victoria to read the warning signs in Richard's behavior. The tight set of his jaw when he was frustrated, the way his manicured fingers drummed against his crystal whiskey glass when he was losing patience, the dismissive tone that had grown more frequent over the past 5 years. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the quarterly report spread across his mahogany desk showed discrepancies that could cost them both millions. Tonight, Victoria had discovered financial irregularities that demanded immediate attention. Regardless of Richard's precious investor meeting, this affects both our portfolios. Richard, the Henderson deal could cost us everything if you don't listen to what I found. The room fell silent. 3 sets of expensive suits turned to stare at her with varying degrees of annoyance and surprise. Richard's face flushed red above his perfectly knotted silk tie. "Damn it, Victoria, can't you see I'm in the middle of something important?" The physical push came without warning. Not hard enough to truly injure, but deliberate enough to send Victoria stumbling backward through the doorway into the marble hallway. Her designer heels scraped against the floor as she fought to maintain her balance. The study door slammed shut with a resounding bang that echoed through their sprawling Connecticut mansion, leaving her staring at the polished wood while masculine voices resumed their conversation behind it. Victoria stood in the hallway for a long moment, her reflection staring back at her from the antique mirror hanging opposite the study. 51 years old, impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed, and completely invisible to the man she had spent more than 2 decades building an empire alongside. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who had everything money could buy. Designer clothes, professional makeup, jewelry worth more than most people's houses, but her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had been slowly disappearing, piece by piece, decision by decision, until she barely recognized herself. 23 years, Richard, she whispered to the closed door. And you just made your biggest mistake. Victoria walked slowly toward the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs that decorated their home. Each step felt like waking up from a dream she hadn't realized she was having. The push had been physical, yes, but it represented something much deeper. It was the culmination of years of being dismissed, ignored, and treated like an accessory to Richard's increasingly narcissistic abuse of power. In their bedroom, Victoria sat at her antique vanity and began removing her jewelry piece by piece. Each item had a story. The pearl necklace had been a wedding gift from her grandmother. The diamond bracelet was from their 10th anniversary. The emerald earrings were from the night Richard's company went public, making them both incredibly wealthy. But as she looked at these symbols of their shared success, Victoria realized something that would change everything. She had brought more than love to their marriage. She had brought capital, connections, and business acumen that had been instrumental in building the Blackwood Empire. Yet somewhere along the way, her contributions had been forgotten, minimized, and ultimately dismissed entirely. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as a quiet, cold certainty that settled in her chest like winter morning air. Richard had just shown her exactly what he thought of their partnership, their marriage, and her worth as both a business partner and a human being. Victoria opened the antique jewelry box that had belonged to her mother and pulled out a small key she hadn't used in years. It was the key to their private safe, where the most important documents of their marriage and business partnership were stored. Documents that Richard assumed were safely locked away from prying eyes. Documents that might reveal just how much power Victoria actually possessed. As she prepared for bed, Victoria's mind was already working through possibilities. Richard thought he held all the cards in their relationship. He controlled the day-to-day operations of their business. He made the major financial decisions. He networked with investors and politicians who could make or break their empire. But Victoria knew something Richard had forgotten in his arrogance. She knew exactly how their partnership had been structured in those early days when Richard was desperate for capital and connections. She knew who had really funded the initial expansion that turned a small tech startup into a multi-million-dollar corporation. And most importantly, she knew that some mistakes could not be undone once they were made. Richard's physical push had been more than an act of disrespect. It had been a declaration of war. Victoria Blackwood had always been underestimated by her father, who thought women shouldn't be involved in serious business, by her professors at Columbia Business School, who assumed she was there to find a husband rather than build a career, by Richard himself, who had initially pursued her for her family's money and connections, but had gradually convinced himself that his own brilliance was responsible for their success. Tomorrow, Victoria would begin the process of reminding everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Tonight, she would plan her first moves in a game that Richard didn't even know had begun. The last thing Victoria did before turning off the lights was to look at herself one more time in the vanity mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different than she had just hours earlier. There was something new in her eyes, something that had been dormant for years but was now fully awake. It was the look of a woman who had just remembered her own power. The next morning found Victoria in her pristine kitchen at 6 a.m., exactly 3 hours before Richard typically emerged from their bedroom. The coffee machine hummed quietly as she spread financial documents across the granite island that served as the heart of their domestic life. Morning news played softly in the background, but Victoria's attention was focused entirely on the papers before her. These weren't the quarterly reports she had tried to discuss with Richard the night before. These were older documents, pulled from their private safe before dawn while Richard slept off his whiskey-fueled investor meeting. Documents that told the real story of how Blackwood Industries had been built. Mrs. Blackwood Sarah Chen, Victoria's 28-year-old assistant, appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a leather portfolio. "I brought the quarterly reports you requested, along with the research on the Henderson acquisition." Sarah had been working for Victoria for 3 years, initially hired to manage Victoria's extensive charity work and social obligations. But Victoria had quickly discovered that the young woman had a sharp mind for business and an even sharper eye for detail. "Sarah, in all your research into our financial structure, have you ever looked closely at the actual ownership documents for Blackwood Industries?" Sarah set down her portfolio and poured herself a cup of coffee from the machine. "Well, I always assumed it was a 50-50 partnership between you and Mr. Blackwood. That's what all the business publications report." Victoria smiled for the first time since the previous evening. "That's what everyone assumes, including my dear husband." She pulled out a manila folder from the safe documents and opened it to reveal a signature page from 1998. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, but the legal language was crystal clear. "Sarah, what do you see when you look at this ownership structure?" Sarah studied the document carefully, her expression changing as she read through the legal terminology. "Mrs. Blackwood, this shows you as the majority shareholder. 51% of Blackwood Industries. My father always told me never to give up complete control, even in marriage. Especially in marriage, actually. Richard was so desperate for my family's investment capital back then. He would have signed anything I put in front of him." Victoria remembered those early days with perfect clarity. Richard had been brilliant but broke, a tech entrepreneur with revolutionary ideas but no money to implement them. Victoria had been fresh out of Columbia with her MBA, armed with a trust fund from her father's manufacturing empire and connections throughout New York's financial community. The marriage had been passionate and pragmatic in equal measure. Richard got the funding and legitimacy he needed to build his company. Victoria got a partnership with someone whose vision matched her own ambition. It had been the perfect arrangement for two people who understood that love and business success were not mutually exclusive. But somewhere in the intervening years, as their wealth grew and their social status climbed, Richard had begun to rewrite their history. In his version of events, he was the visionary genius who had built an empire through his own brilliance. Victoria became the supportive wife who had provided some early financial assistance. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah said carefully, "if you control 51% of the company, then technically you have final approval authority over all major decisions, including acquisitions that could cost us millions of dollars." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. "Playing golf with Henderson and his team today? We'll discuss final details. Don't wait up." The casual dismissiveness of the message was exactly what Victoria had come to expect. Richard conducting major business negotiations without consulting her had become routine. Her input was no longer requested or apparently needed. But looking at the ownership documents spread across her kitchen island, Victoria realized that Richard's confidence was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of their legal relationship. He had been making decisions for years as if he controlled the company, when in reality, Victoria could override any decision he made. "Sarah, I want you to do something for me." Very quietly, "I want you to research the Henderson acquisition from a different angle. Instead of looking at why it might be profitable, I want you to look at what could go wrong. What kind of problems should I look for? Everything: environmental issues, labor disputes, regulatory problems, hidden debts. If this deal has any skeletons in its closet, I want to know about them before Richard signs anything." As Sarah left to begin her research, Victoria found herself thinking about the moment when she had first fallen in love with Richard Blackwood. It had been at a tech conference in Silicon Valley. She was there representing her father's investment firm, looking for emerging companies that might be worth backing. Richard had been presenting his vision for what would eventually become their flagship software platform. He had been magnetic on stage, confident without being arrogant, visionary without being unrealistic. After his presentation, Victoria had approached him with what she thought was a straightforward business proposition: her family's money in exchange for a significant ownership stake in his company. Richard had been intrigued by more than just her investment offer. Their first dinner meeting had lasted until 3 in the morning as they discussed business strategy, technology trends, and their shared belief that the internet would fundamentally change how people worked and lived. 6 months later, they were married. 12 months after that, Blackwood Industries was incorporated with Victoria as the majority shareholder and Richard as the chief executive officer. It had been the perfect partnership between vision and capital, ambition and pragmatism. But successful partnerships require mutual respect and ongoing communication. And respect, Victoria was learning, was something that could erode so gradually that you didn't notice it was gone until someone pushed you out of your own business meeting. The irony was not lost on her. Richard thought he was protecting his empire from outside threats, conducting secretive negotiations to maintain his competitive advantage. He had no idea that the biggest threat to his control was sitting in their kitchen, drinking coffee and reviewing documents that proved she had never given up the power to stop him. Victoria's internal monologue began to shift into something she hadn't felt in years. How many women have felt invisible in their own homes? She wondered. How many of us have been pushed aside, literally or figuratively, while the men in our lives make decisions about our future? How many of us have forgotten that we once had power, only to rediscover it in moments of crisis? The awakening was not dramatic. It was quiet and methodical, like dawn breaking over the Connecticut hills outside their kitchen windows. But it was irreversible. Victoria Blackwood was remembering who she had been before she became Richard's wife. She was remembering the woman who had negotiated million-dollar deals before her 25th birthday. That woman was about to make her return. Victoria met her longtime friend Margaret Chen at Le Bernardin 3 days later, settling into their usual corner table where Manhattan's elite conducted their most sensitive conversations. The restaurant's discreet atmosphere and exceptional service made it perfect for discussions that required both privacy and legitimacy. Margaret had been Victoria's classmate at Columbia Business School, one of the few women in their MBA program who had gone on to build a powerhouse career in mergers and acquisitions. Over the past 30 years, she had orchestrated some of the decade's most complex corporate takeovers, earning a reputation for finding opportunities that others missed and executing deals that others considered impossible. "Victoria, darling, you look like a woman with a plan," Margaret said as she settled into her chair, her designer suit impeccable despite having flown in from Hong Kong that morning. "Should I be worried for Richard? Margaret, you've been handling high-stakes divorces and business separations for 3 decades. If someone wanted to quietly investigate their spouse's business dealings, hypothetically speaking, where would they start?" Margaret's laugh was knowing and slightly predatory. Hypothetically, I would start with the accounting firm. Forensic accountants can find money trails that would make bloodhounds jealous. They specialize in discovering assets that people think they've hidden successfully. Victoria had known this conversation was necessary, but she had not expected it to feel so liberating. For the first time in years, she was discussing business strategy with someone who treated her as an equal rather than an accessory. But before we get to forensic accounting, Margaret continued, you need to understand that investigating a spouse's business activities is not just about finding hidden assets. It's about understanding the full scope of their financial exposure, what debts they might have hidden, what legal liabilities they might be carrying, what regulatory problems they might be facing. The waiter appeared to take their lunch order, providing a natural pause in their conversation. Victoria ordered the sea bass, exactly what she always ordered at Le Bernardin. But today, even familiar routines felt different. Today, she was not here as Richard Blackwood's wife making social conversation. She was here as a business owner protecting her interests. Margaret, there are rumors about Richard's recent expansion into overseas markets. Word is he's been moving money through shell companies to minimize tax exposure. Shell companies? Victoria tried to keep her voice casual, but Margaret's expression told her that her friend had picked up on the underlying concern. Paper businesses that exist primarily to move money between jurisdictions. They can be completely legal if properly structured and documented, but they can also be used to hide assets from tax authorities, creditors, or divorce settlements. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. And if someone were to expose improperly structured shell companies to the appropriate authorities, well, hypothetically, it could trigger investigations that might freeze assets pending resolution. Depending on what investigators found, it could result in criminal charges for tax evasion, money laundering, or fraud. Margaret set down her wine glass and leaned forward slightly. Victoria, I've known you for over 20 years. We've been through business school together, celebrated each other's successes, and supported each other through every major life transition. So I'm going to ask you directly, are you planning to divorce Richard? The question hung in the air between them like an undetonated bomb. Victoria had been thinking about divorce for months, but she had not yet said the word out loud to anyone, including herself. I'm planning to protect myself, Victoria said finally. Richard has been making increasingly risky business decisions without consulting me. Last night, he physically pushed me out of a business meeting in our own home. I need to understand exactly what I might be liable for if his risk-taking goes wrong. And if you discover that he's been hiding assets or engaging in questionable financial practices, then I need to decide whether I want to be married to someone who could potentially face federal charges. Margaret nodded slowly. Victoria, I'm going to give you the name of someone who specializes in exactly this type of situation. James Morrison is a private investigator who works exclusively with high-net-worth individuals facing complex marital and business disputes. He's expensive, but he's discreet and thorough. She wrote a phone number on her business card and slid it across the table. Tell him I referred you. He'll understand exactly what kind of investigation you need. As they finished their lunch, Margaret shared stories about other women who had faced similar situations. Wives who had discovered that their husband's business success was built on increasingly fragile foundations. Women who had been forced to choose between their financial security and their personal safety. The most important thing to remember, Margaret said as they prepared to leave, is that knowledge is power. The more you understand about Richard's actual financial situation, the better position you'll be to protect yourself, regardless of what you ultimately decide to do about your marriage. Victoria walked back to her car, feeling something she had not experienced in years. For the first time since Richard had pushed her out of his study, she felt like she was taking action rather than simply reacting to his behavior. But as she drove home to their Connecticut estate, Victoria also felt the weight of what she was contemplating. Investigating your own husband's business practices was not something you could undo. Once she opened this door, there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance that had characterized the past several years of their marriage. Still, as she pulled into their circular driveway and looked up at the mansion they had built together, Victoria knew she was making the right choice. Richard had shown her exactly what he thought of their partnership. Now it was time for her to remember exactly what she was capable of when she stopped asking for permission and started taking control. The woman who had negotiated her first $1 million deal at 24 was still there. Underneath years of playing the role of the supportive wife, it was time to let her out. James Morrison's office occupied the 32nd floor of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, with windows overlooking Central Park and walls lined with certificates that spoke to his expertise in financial crimes investigation. The space smelled like coffee and determination, with the quiet efficiency of someone who specialized in uncovering secrets that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. "Mrs. Blackwood," James said as he gestured for Victoria to take a seat across from his mahogany desk. "Margaret Chen told me you might need my particular expertise." James Morrison looked exactly like what Victoria had expected from a private investigator who worked exclusively with Manhattan's wealthy elite. Mid-50s, immaculately dressed, with the kind of calm confidence that came from 20 years of investigating people who thought they were too smart to get caught. "Mr. Morrison, I need to understand the full scope of my husband's business activities, particularly his recent expansion into international markets. Mrs. Blackwood, before we begin, I want you to understand exactly what this type of investigation entails. I don't just look at bank statements and business filings. I trace money through complex networks of shell companies, offshore accounts, and international transactions. Sometimes what I find can be problematic." Victoria had spent the 3 days since her lunch with Margaret preparing herself mentally for this conversation. She had reviewed every financial document she could access legally, spoken with their family attorney about hypothetical scenarios, and researched the potential consequences of various types of financial irregularities. "I understand the risks, Mr. Morrison. I need to know what those risks actually are." James opened a leather portfolio and began spreading documents across his desk. "I've already done some preliminary research based on publicly available information about Blackwood Industries. What I've found is going to surprise you." Victoria felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm listening." "Your husband has been moving money through 7 different offshore accounts over the past 18 months. Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and several others. But here's the interesting part. He's been doing it under both your names." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Victoria processed this information. "Both our names, Mrs. Blackwood, according to the banking records I've been able to access, you have been listed as a co-signatory on international transfer documents for the past 5 years. Documents that show your electronic signature authorizing transfers of significant amounts of money to offshore accounts." Victoria's mouth went dry. "Mr. Morrison, I have never signed any international transfer documents. I don't even know the account numbers for our offshore holdings." "That's what I was afraid you might say." James pulled out a manila folder containing photocopies of banking documents. Each page showed Victoria's signature, apparently authorizing transfers of hundreds of thousands of dollars to accounts she had never heard of. "Mrs. Blackwood, if these signatures are forged and based on your reaction, I believe they are then your husband has been committing federal crimes that could implicate you as either a co-conspirator or a victim." Victoria studied the documents, recognizing her signature style, but knowing with absolute certainty that she had never seen these papers before. The implications were staggering. "How much money are we talking about?" "Current estimate based on the transfers I've been able to trace. Approximately $57 million moved without your knowledge or consent." The number hit Victoria like a physical blow. $57 million represented a significant portion of their joint net worth. Money that Richard had been moving systematically while maintaining the pretense of consulting her on major financial decisions. "There's more, Mrs. Blackwood. The Henderson acquisition that your husband is currently pursuing, he's planning to fund it primarily with money from these offshore accounts. Money that has been moved through questionable channels using forged authorization documents." Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Richard's name appeared on the screen. "Mr. Morrison, would it be possible to record this conversation? In New York, only one party needs to consent to recording. If you answer that call, you can legally record whatever your husband says to you. Victoria activated her phone's recording feature and answered the call. Hello, Richard. Victoria, I need you to sign some transfer documents when I get home tonight. Just routine paperwork to finalize the Henderson funding structure. Victoria looked directly at James Morrison as she responded. What kind of transfers? Richard, nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. International currency hedging, tax optimization strategies, technical stuff that would bore you. Just trust me. The casual condescension in Richard's voice was infuriating, but Victoria kept her tone neutral. I'll take a look at the documents when you get home. You don't need to read through all the details. Just sign where I've marked the signature lines. We need to move quickly on this. After Richard hung up, Victoria sat in James Morrison's office trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Her husband had been systematically stealing from their joint assets, while simultaneously setting her up to take legal responsibility for his crimes. Mrs. Blackwood, based on what I've found so far, you have two choices. You can confront your husband directly and hope he voluntarily corrects the situation, or you can work with federal authorities to document the full scope of his activities before he has a chance to hide additional evidence. Victoria thought about the woman she had been 25 years ago. That woman would not have hesitated. She would have gathered every piece of evidence, consulted with the best attorneys, and methodically built a case that would protect her interests while holding Richard accountable for his actions. Mr. Morrison, I want you to document everything. Every forged signature, every questionable transfer, every piece of evidence that shows Richard has been operating without my knowledge or consent. And I want you to do it quickly, before he realizes what I've discovered. That's going to require working with federal investigators. The kind of documentation we need to prove forgery and unauthorized transfers requires forensic analysis that only law enforcement agencies can provide. Victoria felt the same cold certainty she had experienced the night Richard pushed her out of his study. Some decisions could not be unmade once they were implemented, but some situations required decisive action, regardless of the personal cost. Do whatever is necessary, Mr. Morrison. Richard has made his choice about how he wants to treat our partnership. Now I'm making mine. As Victoria left James Morrison's office, she realized that she had just crossed a line that would fundamentally change her life. She was no longer just investigating her husband's business practices. She was building a case that could potentially send him to federal prison. But as she thought about the $57 million he had stolen and the forged documents that could have implicated her in his crimes, Victoria felt no regret. Richard had been planning her destruction while pretending to love her. Now it was time for him to discover what happened when you underestimated Victoria Blackwood. Victoria spent the next morning at her favorite day spa, needing the familiar routine of massage and meditation to process everything James Morrison had revealed. But even in the relaxation room, surrounded by soft music and the scent of lavender, she could not escape the reality of her situation. Her marriage was not just failing, it was potentially criminal. The spa had always been Victoria's refuge from the pressures of wealth and social obligations. Here, she was not Mrs. Richard Blackwood, wife of a tech industry titan. She was simply a woman trying to find peace in an increasingly complicated world. Mrs. Blackwood. The spa attendant's voice was soft and apologetic. There's an urgent call for you at the front desk. The caller said it was regarding a family emergency. Victoria's first thought was of her elderly mother, who lived in assisted living in Florida. But when she reached the front desk, the caller was James Morrison. Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to come to my office immediately. I've discovered something that changes everything we discussed yesterday. What kind of something? The kind that requires immediate action. I can't discuss it over the phone. Victoria left the spa without finishing her appointment, driving into Manhattan with a growing sense of dread. James Morrison's voice had carried an urgency that suggested her situation was even worse than she had imagined. When she arrived at his office, James was waiting with a woman Victoria didn't recognize. Tall, blonde, and expensively dressed. She looked like she belonged in Richard's social circle. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Amanda Richardson. She contacted me this morning after hearing through mutual acquaintances that I was investigating Blackwood Industries. Amanda stood to shake Victoria's hand, her grip firm and her expression serious. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances, but I think you need to know that your husband and I have been having an affair for the past 18 months. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, but she managed to remain standing. 23 years of marriage had prepared her for many possibilities, but she had never seriously considered that Richard might be unfaithful. I ended the relationship 6 weeks ago when I discovered that Richard had been using our connection to access my family's banking information. He's been using details about my trust fund to create fraudulent accounts that mirror my legitimate offshore holdings. Victoria sat down heavily in the chair across from James Morrison's desk. He's been using multiple women to create false financial identities. Mrs. Blackwood, James said gently, Amanda is not the only woman Richard has been involved with. Based on my investigation, he has been cultivating relationships with at least 3 wealthy women over the past 2 years. Women whose personal financial information he has been using to create an increasingly complex network of fraudulent accounts. Amanda opened her purse and pulled out a manila folder. These are copies of documents Richard asked me to sign. Investment agreements, banking authorizations, international transfer documents. I signed them because I trusted him, because I thought we were building a future together. Victoria studied the documents, recognizing the same format and language as the papers James had shown her the previous day. Richard had been running a systematic operation, using his charm and social connections to manipulate multiple women into providing access to their family wealth. How much money has he stolen from you? Victoria asked. Approximately $12 million from my trust fund, money that my grandmother left specifically for my children's education and my own retirement security. The scope of Richard's betrayal was becoming clear. He had not just been unfaithful to their marriage. He had been operating a sophisticated financial fraud scheme that victimized multiple women while using Victoria's name and reputation to legitimize his activities. Mrs. Blackwood, James said, there's something else you need to know. Richard has been planning to leave the country. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? He's been liquidating assets and moving money to accounts in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Based on the travel documents I've uncovered, he's planning to disappear within the next 30 days. The realization hit Victoria with stunning clarity. Richard had not been building their empire. He had been systematically destroying it while positioning himself to escape the consequences. The Henderson acquisition was not a legitimate business expansion. It was his final theft before fleeing the country with as much money as he could steal. He's been planning this for years, Victoria said quietly. The shell companies, the forged signatures, the affair, it's all been preparation for abandoning everything and everyone. Amanda nodded. When I confronted him about the missing money from my trust fund, he told me that sometimes people get hurt in business, that I should consider it a learning experience about trusting the wrong person. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from Richard. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Important developments with Henderson deal. The casual dismissiveness of the message now carried an entirely different meaning. Richard was not working late on legitimate business. He was finalizing his escape plan while maintaining the pretense of being a devoted husband. Mrs. Blackwood, James said, we need to move quickly. If Richard realizes that we've discovered his plans, he could accelerate his timeline and disappear before we can document the full scope of his crimes. Victoria thought about the 23 years she had spent building a life with someone who had been systematically betraying her trust. The shared dreams, the collaborative business decisions, the intimate moments that had formed the foundation of their partnership, all of it had been a lie. But underneath the betrayal and the shock, Victoria felt something else emerging. The same cold anger that had sustained her through business school when professors dismissed her contributions. The same determined focus that had driven her to build successful companies before she met Richard. Mr. Morrison, I want you to coordinate with federal authorities immediately. I want every account traced, every forged document authenticated, and every piece of evidence that proves Richard has been defrauding multiple victims. Mrs. Blackwood, Amanda said, I want you to know that I never intended to hurt your marriage. Richard told me that you were getting divorced, that the separation was amicable, and that you had agreed to divide assets equitably. Victoria looked at the younger woman with something approaching sympathy. Amanda had been a victim of Richard's manipulation, just as surely as Victoria had been. Amanda, neither of us is responsible for Richard's choices, but both of us are responsible for making sure he faces the consequences of those choices. As Victoria drove home to Connecticut that evening, she realized that her midlife transformation had accelerated beyond anything she could have imagined. 3 days ago, she had been a wealthy wife dealing with a dismissive husband. Now she was the primary witness in a federal investigation that would likely result in criminal charges against her millionaire ex-husband. The irony was not lost on her. Richard thought he was clever enough to steal millions of dollars and disappear before anyone discovered his crimes. He had no idea that the woman he had been dismissing for years was about to demonstrate exactly why underestimating Victoria Blackwood was the biggest mistake of his life. Victoria's divorce attorney, Patricia Wells, occupied a corner office in one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. With floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and a reputation for protecting women's assets in some of the city's most complex marital dissolutions, Patricia had been recommended by Margaret Chen, who described her as someone who understood that high-stakes divorces were often more about financial warfare than emotional resolution. Victoria, what you've discovered is not just grounds for divorce, it's grounds for federal prosecution, Patricia said as she reviewed the documents that James Morrison had compiled. Your husband has been operating a sophisticated fraud scheme that victimizes multiple women while using your name and business reputation to legitimize his activities. Victoria sat across from Patricia's mahogany conference table, watching the attorney organize evidence with the precision of a military strategist. Bank statements, forged documents, recorded conversations, and witness statements from Amanda Richardson created a paper trail that painted a damning picture of Richard's criminal activities. Patricia, I want him to pay for every dollar he's stolen, every signature he's forged, and every lie he's told. But I also want to make sure that I'm protected from any criminal liability. That's exactly what we're going to do, but we need to be strategic about timing and coordination. If we move too quickly, Richard might accelerate his escape plans. If we move too slowly, he might succeed in leaving the country with assets that belong to his victims. Patricia spread a timeline across the conference table, showing Richard's financial activities over the past 3 years. The pattern was clear systematic theft disguised as legitimate business expansion, with each fraudulent transaction becoming larger and more brazen. The first thing we need to do is work with federal authorities to freeze the offshore accounts. I have contacts at the Treasury Department who can expedite this process, but we need to provide them with sufficient evidence to justify immediate action. Victoria studied the timeline, recognizing dates that corresponded to family vacations, business trips, and social events. Richard had been stealing from their joint assets while maintaining the pretense of sharing every aspect of their life together. What about the Henderson acquisition? That's where we set the trap, Patricia said with a slight smile. We're going to let Richard proceed with the deal, but we're going to ensure that federal investigators are monitoring every transaction. When he attempts to use stolen money to fund the acquisition, he'll be committing additional felonies in front of witnesses. Victoria felt something she had not experienced in years, the thrill of being truly in control of a complex strategic situation. So when he tries to close the Henderson deal, he'll be arrested for money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, and theft of marital assets. The beauty of this approach is that Richard will have documented his own crimes through his legitimate business activities. Patricia's assistant entered the conference room carrying additional files and a pot of coffee. Victoria recognized the young woman as someone who had handled several high-profile divorce cases that had made headlines in the business press. Mrs. Blackwood, the assistant said, we've received preliminary responses from the federal investigators. They're requesting a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss your cooperation in building their case against your husband. Victoria poured herself a cup of coffee and considered the magnitude of what she was agreeing to undertake. Cooperating with federal investigators meant that her marriage was not just ending, it was becoming the centerpiece of a criminal prosecution that would likely attract significant media attention. Patricia, what are the potential consequences for Richard if he's convicted on all charges, conservatively 7 to 10 years in federal prison, plus complete forfeiture of assets obtained through criminal activity? The prosecution will argue that his entire business expansion over the past 3 years was funded through fraud, which could result in seizure of properties, investments, and business interests worth over $100 million. The number was staggering. Richard had been so focused on stealing millions that he had put their entire fortune at risk. If federal prosecutors could prove that their business success was built on criminal activity, Victoria could lose everything they had built together. But there's good news, and Patricia continued. Because you've been cooperative from the beginning, and because we can demonstrate that you were a victim rather than a co-conspirator, you'll likely be able to retain assets that can be proven to have legitimate origins. Patricia pulled out a legal document that she had been drafting while Victoria met with federal investigators. This is a petition for legal separation based on fraud and criminal activity. It immediately protects you from liability for Richard's future actions while preserving your rights to legitimate marital assets. Victoria read through the document carefully, recognizing legal language that would fundamentally change her relationship with Richard. Once she signed these papers, there would be no possibility of reconciliation or returning to their previous life. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Patricia said. Richard is going to realize eventually that his activities are being investigated. When that happens, he's likely to become desperate and potentially dangerous. I'm recommending that you consider hiring personal security and potentially relocating temporarily until he's been arrested. Victoria thought about the man she had been married to for 23 years. Richard could be arrogant and dismissive, but she had never considered him physically dangerous. But people facing federal prison sentences sometimes made choices they would never have considered under normal circumstances. How long do we have before Richard realizes what's happening? Based on the federal investigators' timeline, probably less than a week. They want to coordinate the asset freezes with his arrest to minimize the possibility that he'll flee the country. Victoria signed the legal separation documents with a steady hand, watching her signature authorize the end of her marriage and the beginning of Richard's prosecution. The woman who had signed these papers was not the same person who had been pushed out of Richard's study just 1 week earlier. That woman had been uncertain, dismissed, and gradually disappearing under years of narcissistic abuse and financial manipulation. This woman was someone Victoria remembered from her early career, decisive, strategic, and absolutely committed to protecting her interests regardless of the personal cost. Patricia, I want you to coordinate closely with the federal prosecutors. I want to make sure that Richard faces consequences, not just for what he's done to me, but for what he's done to Amanda Richardson and every other woman he's victimized. As Victoria left Patricia's office that evening, she realized that her midlife transformation was accelerating into something she had never anticipated. She was not just ending her marriage, she was dismantling a criminal enterprise that her husband had built using her name and reputation. The woman who walked out of that law firm was someone Richard Blackwood had never met. Someone he had been too arrogant and self-absorbed to recognize was emerging from years of being underestimated and dismissed. Tomorrow, that woman would begin the final phase of ensuring that Richard's betrayal became the foundation of his destruction. The Henderson acquisition dinner was held at the Four Seasons, in the private dining room where Manhattan's elite conducted business deals that would reshape entire industries. Victoria arrived separately from Richard, playing the role of the supportive wife, attending an important business function, while knowing that she was actually serving as an undercover witness for federal investigators. James Morrison had briefed her extensively on what to expect. Federal agents would be monitoring the restaurant's communication systems, recording every conversation that took place during the dinner. Victoria's role was to encourage Richard to speak openly about the funding sources for the Henderson deal, providing prosecutors with additional evidence of his criminal activities. "Victoria, darling, you look absolutely stunning tonight," Richard said as she joined the group at their reserved table. He kissed her cheek with the casual affection of someone who had no idea that his wife had spent the past week building a federal case against him. Victoria had chosen her outfit carefully, the red dress Richard had bought her for their 10th anniversary, paired with the diamond necklace he had given her when Blackwood Industries went public. She wanted to look like the perfect corporate wife, while knowing that this would be the last time she would ever play that role. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson, it's wonderful to see you again," Victoria said as she took her seat beside Richard. The Henderson family controlled a manufacturing empire that would complement Blackwood Industries' technology platforms, creating a vertically integrated operation worth over $500 million. "Richard has been so excited about this partnership," Victoria continued. "Haven't you? Darling, he's been working such long hours to make sure every detail is perfect." Richard smiled with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. "The synergies between our companies are remarkable. When we combine Henderson's manufacturing capabilities with our software platforms, we'll be able to dominate markets across 3 continents." Mr. Henderson, a cautious businessman in his 70s, had built his empire through careful analysis and conservative decision-making. "Richard, your enthusiasm is infectious, but I want to make sure we're being realistic about the financial requirements. This kind of expansion requires significant capital investment." "Absolutely," Richard replied. "That's why I've been working so carefully to structure our funding sources. We're using a combination of traditional bank financing and international investment capital to minimize risk while maximizing growth potential." Victoria felt her heart rate increase slightly as Richard began discussing the funding structure that she knew was built on stolen assets and forged documents. Every word he spoke was being recorded by federal investigators who would use his own statements to prosecute him. "International investment capital," Mrs. Henderson asked. "That sounds intriguing. Are you working with European investors, or are you looking at opportunities in Asia?" "Both, actually," Richard said, warming to his subject. "We've been able to access offshore funding sources that provide excellent tax advantages while maintaining full regulatory compliance." Victoria knew that Richard's confidence was based on his belief that she remained ignorant of his criminal activities. He had no idea that the woman sitting beside him had spent the past week documenting every aspect of his fraud scheme. "Richard," Victoria said sweetly, "perhaps you should explain to our friends exactly how you've structured these offshore arrangements. I'm sure they would appreciate understanding the full scope of your financial planning." Richard's smile faltered almost imperceptibly as he looked at Victoria. For just a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief uncertainty about whether her questions were innocent or calculated. "Well, the technical details would probably bore everyone," Richard said carefully. "The important thing is that we have access to the capital we need to make this partnership successful." Mr. Henderson set down his wine glass and leaned forward slightly. "Richard, I appreciate your confidence, but Henderson Industries has been successful for 50 years because we insist on transparency in all our business relationships. If we're going to merge our operations, I need to understand exactly where your funding originates." Victoria watched Richard's face as he realized that his vague explanations were not going to satisfy potential partners who had their own legal and financial advisors reviewing every aspect of the proposed deal. "Of course," Richard said, his voice carrying a slight edge of stress. "The funding comes from a diversified portfolio of international investments, properly managed through our offshore growth strategy to optimize tax efficiency while maintaining full compliance with all applicable regulations." "Offshore growth strategy?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the same sweet tone she had used throughout their marriage when asking about business decisions. "Could you be more specific about which jurisdictions you're using? I'm sure our friends would be interested in the sophisticated international planning you've developed." The room went quiet as everyone at the table recognized that Victoria was asking pointed questions about financial arrangements that Richard clearly preferred to keep vague. Mrs. Henderson glanced at her husband with the expression of someone who had attended enough business dinners to recognize when negotiations were taking an unexpected turn. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice tightening, "these are complex financial instruments that involve proprietary strategies. Perhaps we should focus on the operational synergies that make this partnership so exciting. But Victoria was not finished. She had spent 23 years being dismissed and excluded from important business discussions. Tonight, she was going to use Richard's own arrogance against him. I think our friends deserve to know that the money you're using to fund this acquisition has been moved through 7 different offshore accounts without the knowledge or consent of your business partners, Victoria said, her voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. The table went completely silent. Mr. Henderson's face showed the expression of someone who had just realized that the business deal he was considering might be far more complicated than he had understood. Victoria, Richard hissed, you don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. Richard, I also know that federal investigators are currently reviewing our accounts based on evidence I provided documenting systematic fraud and forgery spanning the past 3 years. Richard's face went white as he realized that Victoria was not asking innocent questions. She was systematically destroying his credibility in front of the very people he needed to trust him with hundreds of millions of dollars. The woman who had been pushed out of his study 1 week earlier was gone. In her place sat someone Richard had never encountered before, someone who understood exactly how to destroy him, using his own words and his own overconfidence. The restaurant erupted in controlled chaos as the business associates processed Victoria's devastating revelation. Mr. Henderson immediately excused himself to make urgent phone calls to his attorneys, while other potential investors began whispered conversations that Richard could hear but not control. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Richard demanded, grabbing Victoria's arm as she stood to collect her purse. Victoria pulled away from his grip with the calm confidence of someone who had anticipated this moment for days. "I'm taking back control of my life, Richard. Something I should have done years ago. You'll destroy everything we've built together. Everything you've stolen. You mean there's a significant difference." Richard's face was flushed red with rage and panic as he realized that his carefully planned acquisition was collapsing in real time. "Victoria, you don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. These business relationships took years to develop. The only consequence I care about is making sure you face accountability for stealing $57 million from our joint assets while setting me up to take legal responsibility for your crimes." As if summoned by Victoria's words, 2 individuals approached their table with the purposeful stride of people who were accustomed to making arrests in high-end establishments. Victoria recognized Agent Sarah Coleman from their coordination meeting earlier that week. Mr. Richard Blackwood. Agent Coleman's voice carried the authority of someone who had been investigating financial crimes for over a decade. "Yes." Richard's voice was shaking slightly as he looked between the federal agents and Victoria's calm expression. "You're under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, and theft of marital assets. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sound of handcuffs clicking into place seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet restaurant. Other diners had stopped their conversations to stare at the scene unfolding in the private dining room, where Manhattan's elite usually conducted their most discreet business. "Victoria," Richard said as Agent Coleman began leading him toward the restaurant's exit, "you have no idea what you've just done to our life." Victoria looked at her husband of 23 years as he was led away in handcuffs, his face a mixture of rage, disbelief, and dawning comprehension that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing. "Richard, I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped you from destroying more lives while protecting myself from the consequences of your criminal behavior." Mr. Henderson approached Victoria as the federal agents left with Richard. "Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to know that Henderson Industries will be conducting our own comprehensive investigation. If what you've told us tonight is accurate, it's all documented. Mr. Henderson, every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, every fraudulent account. The federal investigators have been building their case for weeks." Victoria walked out of the Four Seasons into the cool Manhattan evening, feeling something she had not experienced since her early career, the satisfaction of executing a complex strategic plan with precision and devastating effectiveness. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends and business associates who had already heard news of Richard's arrest. Word traveled quickly through Manhattan's financial community, and Victoria knew that by morning, the story would be front-page news in the business press. But as she stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant where her marriage had effectively ended, Victoria felt remarkably calm. The woman who had been pushed out of Richard's study just 8 days earlier had been uncertain and gradually disappearing under years of dismissive treatment. This woman was someone Victoria recognized from her past decisive, strategic, and absolutely committed to protecting her interests regardless of the personal cost. The woman who had negotiated her first major business deal at 24 years old. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Patricia Wells. "Victoria, I'm watching the news coverage of Richard's arrest. Are you okay?" "I'm perfect, Patricia. Better than I've been in years. The federal prosecutors want to meet tomorrow to discuss your testimony for Richard's trial. Are you prepared for what that's going to involve?" Victoria looked back at the Four Seasons, where Richard had planned to close the deal that would have completed his theft of their joint assets and funded his escape from the country. "Patricia, I've been preparing for this my entire career. Richard made the mistake of thinking that 23 years of marriage had made me weak. He's about to discover exactly how wrong he was." As Victoria walked toward her car, she realized that her midlife transformation was complete. She was no longer Richard Blackwood's wife, struggling to maintain relevance in her own marriage. She was Victoria Blackwood, majority owner of a multi-million-dollar corporation and the primary witness in a federal prosecution that would likely result in her millionaire ex-husband spending the next decade in prison. The woman who had felt invisible just 1 week earlier had just demonstrated to Manhattan's business elite exactly what happened when you underestimated Victoria Blackwood. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of rebuilding her life and her business empire. Tonight, she would celebrate the fact that she had remembered her own power just in time to save herself from destruction. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, Victoria sat in her home office, formerly Richard's private study, reviewing documents that would reshape her life and business empire. The mahogany-paneled room that had once symbolized her exclusion from important decisions now served as the command center for her financial independence and corporate control. The irony was not lost on her. The room where Richard had pushed her out of a business meeting had become the place where she orchestrated his complete downfall and her own resurrection as a formidable business leader. "Victoria," Patricia Wells said through the speakerphone on Victoria's desk, "the final accounting is remarkable. Between the recovered offshore funds, the frozen assets, and the criminal restitution order, you're looking at approximately $83 million returned to your personal accounts." Victoria studied the financial statements spread across her desk, numbers that represented not just money, but vindication of every strategic decision she had made over the past month. The federal investigation had uncovered additional criminal activity that even James Morrison's thorough investigation had missed. What's Richard's current situation? His attorneys are negotiating a plea bargain that would involve 7 to 10 years in federal prison. The prosecution has been clear that the plea agreement would include complete forfeiture of all claims to Blackwood Industries and any assets that can be traced to his criminal activities. Victoria hung up the phone and walked to the window overlooking their Connecticut estate. At 51 years old, she was wealthier than she had ever imagined possible, completely free from a marriage that had become increasingly toxic, and positioned to rebuild her business empire according to her own vision, rather than Richard's increasingly reckless ambitions. The doorbell rang, and Victoria heard Sarah's voice greeting someone at the front entrance. A few moments later, her assistant appeared in the study doorway, carrying an envelope marked with the logo of Richard's legal team. "Mrs. Blackwood, this was delivered by courier. The attorney said it required your immediate attention." Victoria opened the envelope to find divorce papers that had already been signed by Richard's attorney on his behalf. The document was accompanied by a brief note in Richard's handwriting. "Victoria, you've destroyed everything we built together. I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished." Victoria read the note twice, then set it aside with something approaching amusement. Even facing federal prison, Richard remained convinced that he was the victim of Victoria's unreasonable behavior, rather than the architect of his own destruction through systematic criminal activity. Sarah, please call Patricia Wells and let her know that Richard has expedited the divorce proceedings. Also, schedule a meeting with the board of directors for next week. It's time to discuss the future leadership structure of Blackwood Industries. As Sarah left to make the calls, Victoria realized that she was experiencing something she had not felt in decades: complete control over her own destiny. For 23 years, her life had been shaped by Richard's decisions, his ambitions, his vision of their shared future. Now, for the first time since their early marriage, Victoria was free to pursue her own goals without compromise or consultation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Chen. Saw the news coverage of Richard's plea negotiations. Are you ready to discuss what comes next for your career? Victoria smiled as she typed her response. More than ready. Let's talk about building something that Richard never could have imagined. The federal prosecutors had estimated that Richard's trial would begin within 6 months. Assuming he rejected the plea agreement currently being negotiated, Victoria would be the prosecution's primary witness, testifying about the forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, and systematic deception that had characterized the final years of their marriage. But testifying against Richard would not be difficult. Victoria had moved beyond anger into something more powerful: absolute clarity about who Richard actually was, beneath the charm and business success that had initially attracted her. He was someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited, rather than partners to be respected. Victoria's phone rang with a call from Amanda Richardson, the other woman who had been victimized by Richard's financial fraud scheme. Victoria, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to expose Richard's criminal activities. If you hadn't acted when you did, he would have succeeded in disappearing with millions of dollars that belonged to his victims. Amanda, you don't need to thank me. I was protecting my own interests. The fact that it helped other people was simply a beneficial side effect. The federal prosecutors told me that Richard had been planning to leave the country within 2 weeks of when you initiated the investigation. You literally prevented him from escaping justice. After Amanda hung up, Victoria realized that her midlife transformation had accomplished something she had never anticipated. She had not just ended her marriage and recovered stolen assets. She had prevented Richard from destroying additional lives while building a criminal empire that could have operated for years before being discovered. The woman who had felt invisible in her own home just 1 month earlier had become the central figure in dismantling a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that victimized women across Manhattan's social elite. Victoria opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the board of directors, announcing her intention to assume active leadership of Blackwood Industries. As the majority shareholder, she had always possessed the authority to make this decision. She had simply allowed Richard to convince her that her role should be advisory rather than executive. Tomorrow, she would begin implementing changes that would transform their technology company into something more aligned with her own values and vision. The first initiative would be a comprehensive audit of all business practices to ensure that no traces of Richard's criminal activities remain embedded in their corporate structure. The second initiative would be more personal. Victoria had decided to establish a foundation focused on helping women recognize and escape from situations involving financial abuse and narcissistic manipulation. Women like herself, who had gradually surrendered their own agency to partners who viewed them as accessories rather than equals. The foundation would provide legal assistance, financial counseling, and investigative services to women who suspected that their spouses or partners were engaged in financial crimes that could implicate them as unwitting co-conspirators. Victoria looked around the study that had once represented her exclusion from important decisions and now symbolized her complete control over her own destiny. In just 4 weeks, she had evolved from a dismissed wife into the primary witness in a federal prosecution, from a silent partner into the majority owner of a major corporation. The transformation had been painful but necessary, and it was far from complete. 6 months later, Victoria met Margaret Chen at their new favorite spot, a small cafe in Brooklyn that donated its profits to women's shelters, and had become a symbol of how successful women could use their resources to create positive change in their communities. "Victoria, you look like a completely different person," Margaret said as she settled into her chair across from the small table near the cafe's front windows. "Have I mentioned how proud I am of what you've accomplished?" Victoria smiled as she sipped her coffee, watching the morning rush of Brooklyn commuters hurrying to catch trains that would carry them into Manhattan's financial district. Each person represented a story, a struggle, and choices between accepting what life offered them and fighting for what they truly deserved. "Margaret, you know what the strangest part of this entire experience has been for 23 years. I thought I needed Richard's approval to make important decisions. It turns out, the most important decision I ever made was learning to trust my own judgment and the Blackwood Foundation for Women's Financial Independence. We officially open our first office next month. We've already received over 200 inquiries from women who suspect their spouses or partners are engaged in financial activities that could implicate them in criminal behavior." Victoria had spent the past 6 months working with attorneys, financial advisors, and federal investigators to create something meaningful from her experience with Richard's betrayal. The foundation would provide free legal consultation, forensic accounting services, and investigative support to women facing situations similar to her own. "The most rewarding part," Victoria continued, "is working with women who are just beginning to recognize that their financial security has been compromised by someone they trusted. Yesterday, I met with a woman whose husband had been forging her signature on business loan documents for 3 years. Margaret nodded knowingly. "Financial abuse is much more common than most people realize. The problem is that women often don't recognize it until the legal consequences become unavoidable." Victoria thought about her own experience of gradually surrendering financial control to Richard over the years of their marriage. The process had been so subtle that she had not recognized it as abuse until she discovered the forged signatures and unauthorized transfers that could have resulted in her facing federal charges as a co-conspirator. "The Foundation's first major case involves a situation that's remarkably similar to what Richard was doing to me," Victoria said. "A woman in Manhattan whose millionaire ex-husband had been using shell companies to hide assets during their divorce proceedings. Ikdani, how is Richard adjusting to federal prison?" Victoria's expression showed neither satisfaction nor sympathy. "According to his attorneys, he's maintaining his innocence and blaming me for destroying our marriage and his business reputation. Apparently, he's convinced his fellow inmates that he's the victim of a vindictive wife who couldn't appreciate his business genius. Even in prison, he's still engaging in narcissistic abuse patterns, which is exactly why the Foundation's work is so important. Richard genuinely believes that he was entitled to steal from our joint assets because he viewed himself as the superior business partner. That kind of thinking doesn't change just because someone faces legal consequences." Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, who now served as the Foundation's executive director, in addition to her role as Victoria's personal assistant. "The Forbes reporter is here for your interview about women's financial independence." Victoria had been selected for the magazine's cover story about women who had transformed personal crises into business opportunities that created positive social change. The article would focus on how she had evolved from a victim of financial fraud into an advocate for other women facing similar situations. "Margaret, do you remember what I told that reporter from the Wall Street Journal last month? Refresh my memory. I said that the best revenge is not destruction, it's transformation. Richard thought he could steal my money and my identity. Instead, he gave me the motivation to become someone far more powerful than I had ever been as his wife." Victoria finished her coffee and prepared to leave for the interview that would position her as a national spokesperson for women's financial rights. The Foundation had already attracted attention from celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who recognized the importance of helping women protect themselves from financial manipulation. "You know what I've learned through this entire experience," Victoria said as she stood to leave. "Some women are born fighters. Others have fighting thrust upon them by circumstances they never anticipated. But either way, we have the capacity to not just survive, but to transform our lives in ways that seemed impossible before we were tested. Margaret hugged her goodbye with the warmth of someone who had witnessed Victoria's complete transformation, from dismissed wife to formidable business leader and social advocate. As Victoria walked toward her car, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Richard's study to this cafe in Brooklyn. The woman who had been pushed out of that business meeting 8 months earlier had been uncertain, gradually disappearing under years of dismissive treatment and financial manipulation. This woman was someone Victoria recognized from her early career, decisive, strategic, and absolutely committed to using her success to create opportunities for other women facing similar challenges. The foundation's first client had been a woman whose husband was hiding assets in offshore accounts during their divorce proceedings. Victoria had been able to connect her with forensic accountants and federal investigators who discovered a fraud scheme that had been operating for over 5 years. "Some women are born fighters," Victoria said to herself as she drove back toward Manhattan. "Others have fighting thrust upon them. Either way, we always find a way to win." Her phone rang with a call from a producer at CNN who wanted to discuss Victoria's appearance on a segment about financial abuse in high-income marriages. The story of her successful prosecution of Richard had resonated with women across the country who recognized similar patterns in their own relationships. Victoria answered the call with the confidence of someone who had learned that her most devastating personal crisis could become the foundation for her most meaningful professional achievement. She was no longer Richard Blackwood's wife, struggling to maintain relevance in her own marriage. She was Victoria Blackwood, majority owner of a successful technology company, founder of a national foundation for women's financial independence, and living proof that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage of all. The woman who had once felt invisible had become impossible to ignore, and she was just getting started.